You should have a seat. We are studying the life of Abraham. Last week we started in a series walking through Abraham's life. We started with him in Ur of Chaldee, where God comes to him and says, I want you to get out and start walking. So Abraham trusts God. He heads out. He goes to a place called Haran, and for some reason they stay there for a little while. And eventually Abram leaves Haran and heads on to, basically comes to Shechem. He worships God. God appears to him there. He worships God there. Then he goes on to Bethel, between Bethel and Ai. He builds an altar there. And then ultimately he heads to the Negev. And when we pick up our story this morning, that's where he is. He's in the Negev, and things start to get very, very rough. So Genesis chapter 12, here's what it says. It says, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And he was about to enter Egypt, and he said to his wife Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Every woman wants to hear that. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they'll let you live. So, say you are my sister, so that I'll be treated well for your sake, and your life will be spared because of you. And when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was a very beautiful woman, and when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female, donkeys, male and female servants, camels. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarah. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and said, what have you done to me? And he said, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? So that I took her to be my wife. He brought her into his harem. Then Pharaoh gave orders that now that she is here, here is your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way, and his wife and everything that he had. Now, this passage presents a whole bunch of problems for us. Because here's the deal. The guy lies, and he comes out well. I mean, aren't we taught that when you do right, you get right? When you do wrong, you get wrong? I mean, isn't that what we're taught? But yet, that's not what this passage teaches. This passage actually gives us the impression that there are certain situations it's okay to lie. And there are certain situations, not only is it okay to lie, but you're going to come out ahead by lying. Because that's what happens in this story. I think there's a ton of lessons in this story, and we'll wrestle with that theological conundrum in a minute. Let's make sure, first of all, we understand the story. What happens is, Abram is in the Negev, that's the southern part of Israel, and there becomes a famine in the land, and he has to figure out a solution. Now, what's interesting is the passage does not say at any point that he seeks God. In fact, when he comes back from Egypt, he's going to seek God. But at this point, the last time we have it is Bethel and Ai. He's worshiping, and then he goes on the Negev. Now all of a sudden difficulty comes, and we don't find him saying, God, what do I do? We find him going, I need to go to Egypt. So he decides to head to Egypt. So he loads everybody up, and he goes to Egypt. And then he realizes, when I get to Egypt, there's going to be a problem. And that she's a whole lot better looking than me. And they're going to want her, and the easiest way to get her is to take me out, because that was a common way to do it. You know, you've got a beautiful wife, and I want her, then the bottom line is, and I'm the Pharaoh, I just kill you, and she's my wife. That's a simple solution. Especially when you're like the most important person in the land, you can do whatever you want. So he comes up with a plan, and he says, all right, I need you when we get there. Don't let them know you're my wife. Tell them you're my sister. Now, here's the interesting thing. It was kind of a half-truth, because they were kind of related. Just not the whole truth. So they get there, and I mean, just the implications of this. Think of the situation he is now putting her in. And why is he putting her in that situation? Because it's all about him. It's all about, if you tell her you're my wife, you tell him you're my wife, then he's going to kill me. So that I can live, I need you to lie, and I need you, let's be realistic here, to be willing to do that which is immoral in order for me to save my life. So he now comes to her and says, and she does. She looks at him and says, she says, yeah, that's, he said, that's my sister. And he goes, oh, well, she's, Pharaoh, you got to check out this gal. And Pharaoh checks her out and he says, yep, I want her too. Well, she's got a brother with her. Well, give him whatever he wants. And they load him up. He has won the jackpot, folks. He's gotten cattle, he's gotten donkeys, he's gotten camels, he's gotten a set of servants now. He's got all of this stuff from Pharaoh, which would have been the best of the best. And he's living in the lap of luxury, and he's lied his way into this whole thing. And then all of a sudden stuff starts going south for Pharaoh. So Pharaoh does a deep dive. He gets all of his important people together and he says, okay, guys, we got to figure out what's going on here. And they finally connect all the dots and they say, you know when all of this started was when you took that, you remember that gal Sarai? Remember you took her? That's kind of when everything started. So I'm going to guess they bring her in and they say, tell us the story. And she tells them the story because he then calls for Abram. When Abram comes in, he knows at that point that Abram and Sarah were married, and he confronts Abram and says, why did you do this? Why in the world did you tell me she was your sister when she was your wife? And he then kicks him out of the country now. And when he goes, you're going to see this in the next chapter, when he goes, he takes all this stuff with him. So he comes out smelling like a rose. And that presents some problems for us. So let's dive into some lessons that I think are important for us from the life of Abram. And I think some really life-changing principles if we will approach them. Here's first one is this. I think in this passage you see a lordship principle. Lordship principle means this. Who's going to call the shots, Abram? You or God? Now, when he left Ur of Chaldees, it was God calling the shots. God said, you go to a country, I'll show you where to go. And he trusted God and he followed God. He then stops at Shechem and worships God. He then stops at Bethel and worships God. But now when he's in the Negev, he decides because there's a famine in the land, he's got to solve his problem. So he doesn't run to God. We don't get any implication whatsoever that he goes to God and says, okay, God, will you take care of me during this famine? By the way, there's another guy later by the name of Elijah, and there's a famine in the land for 3.5 years. He trusts God, and it ends up being birds and a widow woman feed him for 3.5 years. But no. Abram, he's trying to figure this out. Okay, this is a bad situation. I got to figure out what to do. I know. I'll go to Egypt. They got plenty of stuff and plenty of food down there. So I'm going to go there. And then on the way, he realizes, you know what? This is going to be hard because I could lose my life now. So let's figure out how I can save my life. Throws out his whole moral code. Basically now looks at his wife and says, okay, I need you to lie. I understand that this might be hard and uncomfortable for you, but if you don't do this, I could die. So you need to do this for me. All of a sudden now, he's the guy calling all of the shots. Here's a question for you. Who's calling the shots? Who's calling the shots in your life? Are you looking at whatever situation you're up against, whatever difficulty you're up against, are you looking at saying, okay, God, what do you want me to do? How do you want me to handle this? Or have you, like Abraham, grabbed this thing and said, okay, I'll get myself out of this mess. I've got this plan. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to do it. Instead of going, okay, what's God say? How does God say I should handle this? Because that's an important principle. Somebody's calling the shots in your life. And if it's not God, then it's you. And Abram gets himself in trouble big time because he starts calling the shots. Second principle here is the blessing principle. When we look at this story, if you were in Abram's shoes, you know what you would assume? That because this came out well, God was okay with it. In other words, it's easy to look at this story and go, you know what, look, at the end of this story, Abram goes back to Israel, and now he's got buku money and buku stuff. He comes out smelling like a rose in this story. Here's what you need to remember. The story is not finished. Don't stop here and assume this is where the story ends. You're going to see in the next chapter, this story ultimately ends up costing him his nephew Lot and his entire family. See, the story's not told. It looks at this point in the story like everything's going great, even though Abraham did that which was wrong. Here's what you need to remember. God's blessing is not necessarily a stamp of God's approval. In fact, I would argue sometimes it's just the opposite, because God says the goodness of God leads to repentance. Here's a Bible thing that will help you understand this principle. You know who is the greatest preacher in all of the Old Testament when you look at results for a specific message? Jonah. Jonah saw more people come to God than any other prophet in the Old Testament. Now, when you read the book of Jonah, here's what you will find about Jonah. Number one, Jonah could care less if these people turned to God. In fact, Jonah didn't want them to turn to God. The only reason Jonah preached is because if he didn't, God was going to make his life miserable. He literally preaches an 8-word Hebrew sermon, then walks away, sits on a hill and says, God, I hope you wipe them out. Can you imagine me walking in here going, and preaching at you and saying, I don't care about any of you, but if you turn to God, He will save you. And then I go sit up on the hill and say, now God, wipe them out. Greatest preacher for results in the Old Testament in one sermon. Jeremiah preached his entire life. Nobody listened. Now you tell me, in the kingdom of God, who is more valuable and who did that which was right in honoring God? But if you want to just look at results, and that's what happens. We look at it in our lives and we're like, you know what? I did this and it was wrong and everything else, but God still blessed me, so it must be okay. No. No, never assume that blessing is approval. Be careful with that. That is a poison that is very easy for us to do. A lot of churches, we've got numbers and we're doing this. Look, growth is not necessarily good. You go, what? What do you mean? Okay, let me explain. Gardening. Let's say I happen to know where some of the best fertilizer in the county is. I have somebody have some access to it. Okay? If I want it. Let's say I go in and I put a ton of fertilizer on all of my plants. Not enough to burn them up, but I just fertilize them to no end. I'm going to get a lot of growth, right? If I do it carefully, I'll get a lot of growth. I didn't say I'd get a lot of fruit. There's a difference. And that's exactly what happens if you're not careful. We assume that because everything's going well, God's happy and God's pleased. No. God is pleased and happy when we're obedient and when we're faithful, regardless of what the consequences of that are. And that's an important principle. Here, Abram looks at it and goes, well, God, you know what? We lied. We got away with it. God blessed us. Look at all the stuff we've got. It must be okay. No, it's still wrong. Be careful. I can't tell you the number of times I hear people go, well, you know what? The Lord just laid this on my heart, and I know that the Lord wants me to do this. And I want to, I don't, but I want to. I want to grab a hold of them and shake them and go, God says this is wrong. Period. Here's the verse. Don't tell me that because it worked out, you think it's okay with God. It's against what he says. If it's against what he says, you can't tell me he was in it. You have just deceived yourself into thinking it's okay because it turned out well for you. And here's what I will say. It turned out well for you now. The story is not finished. I see this over and over and over again. Look, you know as well as I do. Guys, come on. I can convince myself to buy any tool on the planet. I'm serious. I look at stuff on Facebook Marketplace and start to convince myself that I needed it. It happened to me this Christmas. We were up in Sioux Falls. We were up there for the day. I found myself in a hobby shop. I went over to the model airplane thing. I tell you what, I was so close to buying the whole kit caboodle thing to be able to go home and fly. I had even planned in my head how I could put a little concrete runway in my backyard. I'm telling you, I had convinced myself I needed this to be able to relax. Now, I didn't buy it, fortunately, because then and you want to know what the overall writing thing that stopped me from? I'm like, you have 3 drones at home that you don't fly. What makes you think you're actually going to go fly this thing? You go, well, because there's always a reason. Well, it's too windy, and, well, it's a little more complicated than I want. And we can do this, and I watch Christians do it all the time. We convince ourselves that something's okay because it worked out. Be careful. The story's not done here. Third principle you see in the life of Abraham here is a hardship principle. What do you do when stuff gets hard? See, what Abraham does, instead of turning to God, which is what he should have done, he runs south. What do you do when it gets hard? In Abraham's world, it was easier to run to Egypt where there was plenty of food than to stay in Canaan and trust God that God would take care of him every day. That's what God did for Elijah. Elijah has a much greater story. He was fed by birds, and then he was fed by a widow woman who didn't have anything to eat. But every day God provided. So you have both of those things that are happening. You have both of those stories that are playing out. And yet, one of them, you find somebody who ran away to find an easier path than somebody who stayed when the path was hard. What do you do? What do? You choose the easy route? Kids, listen to me. Particularly those of you in junior high, high school, college. You do the easy thing now, life will get harder. You do the hard thing now, life will get easier. It's a life principle. You make the hard choices now, life will get easier. Is that not what they try to teach you in sport? Is that not what they teach? Run, get inside. That way when you get in the game and it gets hard and you want to quit, you're ready for it. Why? Because we're going to push you harder in practice than we do in the game. We do it all kinds of things. My nemesis college course was Greek. Hated it. My brain does not think. My brain cannot associate this with something different. Same thing. I played trombone in junior high. I cannot read notes. For me to look at that note and realize that's the third position on the slide, my brain didn't go there. And so for me, I cheated. And the way I cheated is I would get the thing, I would sit down, and I would write all the numbers underneath. So then all I had to go is 3, 2, 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. That's how I learned how to play music. I knew that certain notes you held longer than other ones. That's how I play it. I've always said, music for me just looks like little black and white people jumping over a fence. That's what it looks like to me. I cannot, my brain doesn't go there. Greek was my hardest subject. My brain did not go there, okay? It just doesn't go there. I'm kind of a black and white kind of person. So I just see things connect. To go connect, and that doesn't work. So you know what homework I always did every night first? Greek. I got the hardest thing out of the way first. Because I knew I'd never have the energy to do it at the end of the night. Because I didn't want to do it anyway. On chores, when we had chores around the house or the farm or whatever it is, you know which projects you do first? Right now, you know what project I'm doing right now? I'm roofing right now. I've got some roof that I got to put on my house. So as soon as I dropped Gene off the airport, that evening I was up on the roof and tearing some stuff off and a nasty, dirty, miserable project. But it needs to be done, and I've got the time, and so I'm just plugging away with it, 3-4 hours a night and just doing that. It's not the fun project that I want to do. I'd rather be in the shop blowing glass. But it needs to you do the hard things now, life will get easier. You do and case in point, Wednesday night, get the roof all torn off. And again, I'm just doing a porch right now, so a little spot. I just did a porch. And I'm looking at it going, well, the last I saw the weather, it was going to be nice. I don't need to put tar paper on yet. I got tomorrow. Laying in bed, 5 o'clock in the morning, I hear, pull back the window, it's raining. So 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm on the porch, in the rain, rolling out tar paper to cover up this little spot so I don't have to deal with the whole flooded out porch. Why? Because I decided to do the easy thing. I don't need to do this now. I'll just take my time. I won't have to instead of doing the hard thing, going, you know what, just spend another 20 minutes while it's nice, go ahead, put tar paper on, you'll be okay. It's a life principle. Abraham here does the easy thing, and life gets very hard. It doesn't look that way now, because you're looking like he wins. He comes out of there smelling like a rose. The next chapter, because he's got so much stuff, they're fighting. And now the family that he has kept together the entire time now has to split up. And eventually, after splitting up, his nephew Lot is going to start learning about Sodom and Gomorrah. He's going to move his family down there. And he's actually going to become a leader in there. And Abraham's going to have to go down and try to get him out. Why? Where do you think all of that appeal for Sodom came from? He took his nephew down to Egypt and got exposed to all of that stuff. There was a very high price tag that you don't see if you stop reading at the end of chapter 12. The last idea is this idea of the choices that you make. Again, we don't see the true price tag here. Do you think his wife ever looked at him the same after this? I want to talk about that. Do you think he had any kind of testimony whatsoever about his Israelite God in Egypt after this? You think his nephew Lot respected him after this? No. What do you think about the people who work for him? Think they had respect for a guy who would put his wife in that kind of situation? See, we don't talk about that. We just look at the stuff. There was a really high price tag he paid for doing what he did. And I want to remind you that we make choices every day, and every one of those choices has a price tag with it. So be careful. That's why it's important to go back to that lordship principle. Lord, is this what you want me to do? Is this where you want me to be? Is this where I need to be following you? What do you say about how I should handle this situation? Yes, Lord, it's going to be hard. For me personally, here's a little, I don't know what you want to call it. Here's a little red flag that I have in my world. Usually, not always, but usually, the easiest path is the wrong one. That's been my experience. The path that's the easiest is usually the wrong one for me. And that's just been my life experience with it. When I'm a parent and there's a choice to make on how I handle my children and how I discipline them or how I instruct them, the hard thing is to confront something. The easy thing is to be their friend. Do the easy thing now, Mom and Dad. It'll get harder. Do the hard thing now. Life will get easier. Here's what I've found. I do have kids who are my friends now. But that was never my goal. It was never my goal. My goal was to be the parent. And even now, there are things where I've had to pull my kids aside and say, this is what I see, this is what I'm concerned about, this is what I want you to be aware of. My granddaughter, who I spend probably more time with than any of the other 3 grandkids right now, it's hard for me sometimes to look at her and say, we're now trying to help with some things. So one of the things that we do is we check every night to find out how she was the night before. And so if she made life miserable for her mom, then when she comes to our house, it's not playtime with grandma and grandpa. It's no, there's a consequence for your behavior last night. And in our world, it's the Legos don't come out. And that's like huge in our world. First of all, because I enjoy it. So it's like dad gets punished, grandpa gets punished too. But you're like, well, wait a minute, it should be grandma and grandpa time, and that should be completely separate. No. My job as a grandparent is to support what my kids are trying to do with their children. It's not to be hero grandpa, although I like being hero grandpa. I'm okay with that. But you know what? Not if I have to make a choice, one or the other. So the hard thing is for us to say, no, we're not going to do that because you need to change your behavior because of the way you acted the night before with mom or with dad. And so now when they call on the way home from school and it's like, hey, so my question now is, Claire wants to talk to you. Okay. Hey, Claire, how were you last night? Oh, good. We're playing Legos today. Awesome. We're good. See you when you get here. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about, folks. The real life kind of stuff. All right? And I want to challenge you because these are principles that get Abraham in trouble. Lordship, who's going to call the shots? Hardship, are you going to run? Are you going to face it? The idea of you going to make the easy choices now or the hard choices? All of these things lay out because there's a price tag that comes with all of this stuff. So I end this morning with this idea. When life gets difficult in Canaan, Abram flees to Egypt. Instead of seeking God, he focuses on himself, and it makes a set of terrible choices. While those choices benefit him in the short term, they cost him dearly in the long term. Be careful about making the easy choices when you're faced with challenging time. Allow God to direct your path, even though it may be harder. Let's pray. Lord, help us. God, it's so easy for us. We're a world that's conditioned to a soft, easy, painless kind of life. Hardship, difficulty, struggle, Lord, it's something that we really, as a culture, don't have a lot of experience with. But Lord, if we're going to be the kind of people that you desire us to be, then we have to be able to develop that. So help us to be able to do that. When hardship come, don't let us run. When difficult decisions lie in front of us, help us to choose and do the right thing, the thing that honors you. And Lord, when it is all said and done, may we be faithful in following you, in sticking close to you, in doing what honors you. These things we ask in your name. Amen.